Hello guys, how are you? I hope all is fine, and I'm just going to deliver another short video, and we are actually doing it on a regular basis for some times, and just for the continuation of the concepts related to the book, which is aerodynamics for the engineering students. Also, we have actually taken out the same topic from the last video book, and also the author is also the same. And the topic right now is the variations of power and specific fuel consumption with velocity and altitude. We have explained to you in the last bit of the example, or last bit of the video as well, that we were dealing with the four-stroke internal combustion engine, the Otto cycle. And in that video we discussed about the specific fuel consumption rho of P, and also we discussed about power output of engine. Because of the engine, we discussed about the power as well, and we discussed the relationship as well. So right now in this we're going to discuss how the variations of power and specific fuel consumption is normally take place with velocity and altitude. P is the power that comes from the engine shaft. It is sometimes called the shaft power. We have explained to you, because of the crankshaft or shaft present in the engine and connected to the connecting rod, which is connected to the piston. Piston is in the cylinder, and also it is a whole actually structure. That power generated by the shaft is known as the shaft power. Structure is that, consider an engine mounted on an airplane. Okay, you just have to consider, obviously there is an engine on the airplane, and also as the airplane velocity, which is v of infinity, is changed, and it is the free airstream velocity. You keep in mind the only variable affected in equation, which is this one, this equation which we have discussed in the last video, which is pressure is directly proportional to displacement, which is the mean average pressure PE, and which is the RPM as well. Okay, so V of infinity is changed. The only variable affected in equation is the pressure of air entering the engine manifold due to the stagnation of airflow in the engine intel. Okay, sometimes this is called a ram effect, and it is normally called a ram effect. And V is at V of infinity. When we're going to increase the velocity, it will directly have an impact on the pressure of ram pressure, or the ram effect. And also it is directly related to the pressure or the power output, and it is also known as the ram effect because of the power, because of the ram, and that is directly proportional to the actually power because of the, or the PE is normally not the power because of the output power or because of the engine. It is the mean average pressure. Okay, when going to velocity is directly related to the pressure. You keep in mind, sorry to say if I actually misquoted as an power, and velocity is directly proportional to pressure due to the ram, and because of that it will be the greater would be the mean average pressure, or and also that would be directly proportional to the pressure in general as well. So we have taken let me actually explain this. What is the exact definition is this one: mean effective pressure, PE. That is the mean effective pressure, PE, and that is why it has been actually, and it has a P ram effect, and it is normally created by the velocity when we're going to increase the velocity. So by this relationship, which normally is significant, was significant in World War II, but nowadays one can ignore. So P is reasonably constant with velocity, which is free air stream velocity. So we can assume that pressure is reasonably constant with velocity, and that is first of all the relationship, that how we're going to variation of power and specific fuel consumption with velocity and altitude. So power is reasonably constant with velocity of which is the airstream velocity. So it is normally constant. There is no such change with velocity. Now we're going to talk the power in terms of altitude. Let's see what would be the relationship. So SFC is constant with the velocity, which is air free stream velocity, which is known as the specific fuel consumption, where rho p is constant with this one as well. Okay, so we have discussed both the power and the specific fuel consumption in terms of velocity, and those both are constant. When we're talking about the velocity, the variations would be not as the variation would be remain constant. So as the h changes, which is the altitude, PE, which is the mean effective pressure, also changes. The air pressure also, which is the air density, decreases with an increase in altitude. Okay, the air pressure, also air density, decreases with an increase in altitude, in turn reduces P of E in equation, which directly reduces P. Normally the air pressure, also air density, the air pressure, which is known as the air density, decreases with an increase in altitude, in turn reduces P of E in equation, which directly reduces P. Okay, so the variation of P with altitude is usually given as a function of local air density. The variation of P with altitude, the variation of P with altitude is usually given as a function of local air density. You need to understand the variation of P with altitude, and with obviously you need to vary the power with altitude h is usually given as a function of local air density. That is the point. To a first approximation, we can assume this ratio is equal to this ratio, which is the density ratio. The pressure ratio will be, or the power output ratio, or the power ratio would be this regularly proportional to the rho, or the density. Okay, so this is how it will going to have an effect on the height as well, because normally this density, which is known as the air pressure, decreases when there is an increase in altitude. So obviously density, air pressure and altitudes are directly related to the power, so that is known as the shaft power output. So which is the Torenbeck, which is empirical correlation. Torenbeck empirical correlation is in front of you, which is P divided by P of naught is equal to 1.132, and rho over P, rho naught minus 0.132. That is the whole relationship, which is a Torenbeck empirical correlation. So from this correlation, we need to actually calculate or derive some of further calculations just to get to this point. But right now, just for the sake of providing you the information or the technical info, you just need to understand that this whole equation is defined or pronounced as Torenbeck, and which is also known as the empirical correlation as well. So specific fuel consumption rho is relatively insensitive to changes in altitude, at least for altitude range for general aviation aircraft. So we have dealt the power with the altitude. Okay, now we're going to deal the SFC, specific fuel consumption, with altitude, that because normally it is insensitive. So at least for altitude range for general aviation aircraft, at least it is, we can say the specific fuel consumption is insensitive to the general aviation aircraft. So assumption is specific fuel consumption is constant with altitude. Assumption is specific fuel consumption is constant with altitude. That is why you just have to keep in mind power was constant with velocity, power was constant, specific fuel consumption was also constant with velocity, but there was a slight difference when we talked about the power in terms of altitude, which obviously also refers to as air pressure, which also refers to as rho or density as well. So there was a direct relationship. Okay, so that was the, but what we also derived that this equation when we talked about SFC in terms of altitude, which is h, at least for altitude we can say the SFC is insensitive, and also there is no such changes. So assumption is SFC is constant with altitude. what we assumption is that SFC is constant with altitude. Higher the distance, when you're going to increase the height, and the pressure would be low, and engines without superchargers. Okay, that is why when going to increase the height, the power would decrease, and the engines without superchargers, that is engines without superchargers. This is how you're going to explain engines without superchargers. That is why normally supercharging is a concept applied in World War I, and because of its cost, it was not that much cost effective, so that was not really continued for the later years or the later era. So that is why we can, and I'll just explain that as well, that in World War I, this decrease in power could be eliminated or at least delayed to a higher threshold altitude. Okay, so by compressing the manifold pressure to values above ambient pressure, this compression is carried out by a compressor geared to engine shaft. A turbocharger maintain constant PE. Supercharging, which is high performance military and civil transport airplanes of 1930s and 1940s, era of mature propeller driven aircraft. Obviously, because that was the era of the mature propeller driven aircraft, that adds normally that added expense. So that is why it was no longer continued, as I actually mentioned earlier. So that is the whole relationship. If you are interested in getting the relationship between the variations in pressure and the variation in specific fuel consumption, when we're going to compare it with the velocity, with the airstream free air velocity, and also we're going to compare it with the altitude height, we can have some assumption, and we can have some explanation as well. So this is how you're going to explain it. When the most of the variations has no direct impact, but obviously just talking about the power and talking about you can say the altitude, there is always a directly proportional relationship, but all the others will remain constant. So that is how you're going to say, when you're going to tabulate, when you're going to draw a table, when you're going to have the constant, when there is a constant relationship, so that means that the graph would be linear, and that is how you're going to explain. Or graph not would be linear, it would be just a straight line, whether it is on the x-axis, whether it is on the y-axis, depending upon the chosen axis or the independent and variable dependent and independent variables. Obviously the line would be along the x-axis or along the y-axis. It can be explained if you are interested in, and we can have it, but right now, because of just the theoretical explanation, and we can say that this is just the relationship between the power and specific fuel consumptions with what we can say with velocity, with the free air velocity, and also with the altitude h. We have the explanation in front of you. So this is a small bit of a video with a small theoretical portion that I explained in front of you. If you have any questions, we can obviously take it in an open manner, and in the next video we're going to discuss the propeller with the structure, with the equations, with the just to actually end it of this video. And just to let you know, because this is the reciprocating engine, this is the shaft power, okay, this is the propeller that is in front of you, shaft power P, power available, that is PA, reciprocating engine is this one. PA is less than P, and PA is what? Horse, which is HPR into P. This is HPR into P. This is how you're going to say it. That is HPR into P. Okay, so which is horse power into P, and pressure, which is equal to the power available, and PA is always less than P. Sorry, P is, this is power, this horsepower, which is equal to power available, and P is always less than P. This will be always less than shaft power. So this is the reciprocating engine, and we have discussed the power in terms of what the horsepower, I believe. Okay, so this is how we have explained it. But just to get an idea, just to provide you that simple explanation of different relationships and different variations. That's the reciprocating engine with the propeller. We're going to discuss this propeller with some equations in our next video. Okay, and let's see how we're going to actually explain that one. And meanwhile, I believe so we have just explained this relationship. This one is clear in front of you, which is the velocity, which is directly proportional to the pressure, because this ram pressure, ram effect, and that is the mean effective pressure, and also which is directly proportional to the pressure. P is directly proportional to dp rpm, significant in World War II, but nowadays one can ignore obviously that this relationship, actually that velocity is this increases this. This was significant in World War II, but we cannot actually assume this one nowadays. We just normally say that pressure is constant, is generally constant with velocity. This is generally constant with this. You don't need to have a directly proportional relationship. So that is why it has been because of we have to ignore some of the assumptions. Okay. That is now the difference from the last, you can say, 100 years plus, that we just ignore it, and we just going to have this one, okay, especially in the last 75. But this is for the power when we're going to talk about in terms of velocity, and also we have the same relationship of specific fuel consumption when we talk about with velocity v. Okay, so with velocity of this one, and obviously that is also constant. So when we talk about velocity, we talk about the altitude. When we talk about the specific fuel consumption, that is all in front of you, and there is no such difficulty. So I hope that I have explained, and if there is some error, error in explanation in terms of from engineering perspective and from the logical perspective, if you see, please mention in the comment, and obviously it will help for the viewers, and also eventually help us to actually gain confidence that what we have delivered, if there's some mistake, we obviously going to improve, and we're going to accept that point, just so that we can deliver the point also present the same point in our further videos as well. So the criticism will be open, and if also the questions will be open. I'll actually want the interesting students or interested students or the faculty members, if they are watching, and if they watch this video anytime in future, please do comment, and please share it, so that obviously we can get an idea that we are getting the answers as well. So I hope to see you with another interesting video with the propeller concept. Let's see what we can have in that video. Till then, take care and have a nice day.